Yes, so that's the government's been defeated again for the second time. This on the vote asking for a meaningful vote at the end of the deal. It was a majority of 98, 366 contents, as they call them in the House of Lords, 268 not content. So that is another big defeat of nearly 100 votes, slightly smaller than, by 4, the EU Nationals' defeat. So that means that when it goes from the House of Lords later this evening back across this lobby to the House of Commons, there will be 2 amendments to what the government had hoped would be a very simple bill for the Commons to have to consider. So the government has now been defeated for a second time on this Article 50 bill, and the interesting thing is in that final clause it specifies that if there should be at the end of this process no deal, then there could have to be a parliamentary vote. Now, the government is confident that the Commons will overturn this from the House of Lords, and the House of Lords then won't prolong this process, but one picks up perhaps around 10 Conservative MPs. There were 7 who voted for a similar measure when this was first considered in the House of Commons. And I do think that there was one rather intriguing intervention from Lord Lawson. Lord Lawson saying that he now expected a bad deal and therefore bringing into play the idea of what exactly is it that some Brexiteers are aiming for. Are they aiming for World Trade Organisation terms? That is the fear I have heard from some Conservative MPs that did not vote for this amendment last time and may well do this time. The question is, how many are there? There'll need to be another 10 or 15. At the moment, if the vote was right now, you'd expect the government to win and overturn what the Lords have just done. But there's a few days before that is considered early next week. I have with me Paddy Pantsdown, member of the House of Lords, of course, Liberal Democrats. What do you make of that?
Right, well, Parliament has done its duty. The Brexit debate was all about the sovereignty of Parliament. Parliament has now insisted that it has sovereignty, and it has won it. And for what it's worth, my guess is that when this goes to the Commons, this has more chance of being upheld, that is, the amendment being upheld by the Commons, than probably, I'm sad to say, the European Citizens Bill. It's more likely there'll be a Tory revolt on this than anything else. Here's the point that I find so puzzling. The government said that by insisting Parliament would have a vote, they would weaken their bargaining position. But I recall that Mr. John Major brought the Maastricht Agreement to Parliament twice for their approval. If it didn't weaken his negotiating hand, why should it weaken the government?
Isn't that the point? Many people think that that Maastricht arrangement was quite weak for this country, and that's hardly a great example on your behalf.
No, on the contrary. Maastricht was a very good deal. It weakened his government, but it didn't weaken his negotiating hand. It didn't, in any sense, affect his negotiating hand. It was as strong as it ever was. Now, what they may be worried about is weakening the government. That's a different issue.
The sight of the House of Lords standing there, unelected. The Commons passed this by a huge majority.
Right.
And
it's what the House of Lords is for, Faisal. I may have voted against the House of Lords. I may want to see it. Exactly. We want exactly. We want to see an elected House of Lords. But while the government have refused to allow us to have an elected House of Lords, we have our duty to do, and we did it tonight.
You honestly think that's... how do you think you're going to be judged out in the country, having acted like that and used unelected peers that you don't even believe in?
We've given, in the end, the Commons, of course, could win, but we've given the Commons a chance to think again. That's the duty and role of the House of Lords, and we did it magnificently. And look at the number of Tories who voted with us, people like Michael Heseltine. Look, this is about the sovereignty of Parliament. The government was Prime Minister was trying to get away without Parliament having a say. We've insisted they should. What else is democracy about? But
isn't the reality, though, it is all honing in on what happens if there's no deal at the end of the process?
That's certainly part of the argument, but there's a much more fundamental argument than that. The people have insisted, the High Court has confirmed that, the government wanted to get away without any debate in Parliament, the High Court had to tell them what their limits of power were in a democracy. Now the House of Lords has insisted that there shall be a proper vote in Parliament. What's that about? It's about all sorts of things, but at the heart of it is about asserting the sovereignty of Parliament. That's our job, and that's what we've done.
Why are you now going to vote effectively against the third reading? Why are you going to go back
because
in there?
We did say, we made it very clear that if there was not to be a referendum, I'd have preferred a referendum referendum of the people so that they could make a comment on the final deal. Not an in-out, we accept it's out, but a referendum on the final deal. If that wasn't there, if the people didn't have a say, this would be a defective bill and we wouldn't vote for it. Look, the government have abused the people's vote. They have hijacked the Brexit vote for the hardest debate. They've hijacked the Brexit referendum result for the hardest possible Brexit. The man that leaves us most distant for the European Union. They have no mandate for that whatsoever.
Well, they would argue for 2%, but I spy a Conservative MP here, Anna Soubry. Please,
I'm going to disagree with both of you.
Please let her. I just played devil's advocate.
Can I just? No, I know. Can I just say you've got something rather badly wrong. The House of Commons voted overwhelmingly for us to leave the European Union, and we will leave the European Union. In relation to this amendment, the equivalent of it in the House of Commons was not passed overwhelmingly. It was passed, but it relied on some 7 or 8 Labour MPs to support the government, and Tories like me, I voted against my government because I absolutely agree with the arguments that Paddy has advanced. This is about parliamentary sovereignty. It's not about Brexit. Right. It's about making sure that Parliament... I represent my constituents and the interests of my constituents, and they have a right to be heard, especially if we get no deal. And in that debate, and I listened to a large part of it, we heard Conservatives saying they want a hard Brexit. And forgive me, people had better wake up to the reality of what a hard Brexit would be. My constituents did not vote for a hard Brexit. The people of this country did not vote for a hard Brexit, and it would be so damaging for our country. We don't want it. But if we don't get a deal...
Some people want it. We don't know how many people...
Exactly. And that's why this place, in the event of no deal... Look, the PM has said... This place should work out what happens. The PM has said, if there's a deal, we have a vote. Him in his place, me in my place. That's good. So why can't we have a vote if there's no deal? Why? Because that's what they don't want, because they want a hard Brexit, and they don't want you people...
Do you think some of your colleagues in the Conservative Party, potentially including ministers, are aiming for WTO terms?
Absolutely are. Make no mistake. Well, I think that if you look at it, we've had a cabal working in my party for a number of years who wanted us out of the EU. They've won. They've persuaded the people, that we're going to leave the EU. They're now operating in government to give us the hard Brexit that people like Lord Lawson said he wants. Well, my constituents did not vote for a hard Brexit. They voted to leave the EU, but
I'm just going to bring in Lady Basildon, but if you could just stay with us... No, and I think he had to go.
For the first ever time, I'm perfectly happy to leave it to Anna.
Anna, just confirm, you will be voting for this when it comes back to... Thank you very much, Lord Ashton.
What happens now is that this bill then comes back to the Commons with 2 pieces added. It's like a basket of fruit.
Okay.
So you've got a new piece in it, which is an orange, if you like, and you've got a very juicy fruit in it, which is what the Lords have just passed. Yes. And now the House of Commons decides whether or not to turf out those 2 new amendments or keep the whole. And what I will do is I will vote to keep in this amendment that the Lords have passed, in accordance with my conscience. I don't know.
Okay. You think you've got a chance of...
Faisal, the real thing is that if enough Conservatives abstain, that will have the same effect.
Okay, Lady Basildon. Sorry. Sorry.
Can I now go, Faisal?
Tell me, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's very good of you. Goodbye.
So what do you hope to achieve with this? It's just going to get overturned in the Commons, isn't it?
Well, you say that, but I thought the arguments tonight were very, very persuasive, and it was quite interesting. There were a number of Conservatives who said, but we like this, we're slightly worried that it's going to mean losing the primacy of the Commons, and that's not the case at all. But what is interesting, all we have done tonight is taken the Prime Minister's own words about her wanting to give Parliament a vote at the end of the process and put them into writing, put them into legislation. And it's up for the Commons to look at that. We haven't done anything completely outrageous. We've said, the Prime Minister said she wants Parliament to have a vote. Let's put that on the face of the bill, and not just, and the Prime Minister said, either in the White Paper or in the House of Commons.
Okay, so, and do you feel, what about those criticisms that you heard in the House of Lords there, that people say that you're an unelected, well, you are an unelected chamber, and you've overstepped the mark here. You're asking for effective veto at the end of the process.
No,
by the Lords.
absolutely.
Effectively, the Lords at the end of this process could, if there's no deal, say no.
No, the Lords never has a veto, and I think it was quite clear. If that's how people interpret it, if that's how people interpret the Prime Minister's words, that can be resolved and sorted out. The Lords doesn't want a veto. What the House of Lords wants is Parliament to have a say. At the end of the day, the final say should always be with the elected House, the House of Commons. And that got a little bit confused in some of the debate today, because nobody is arguing for the Lords to have a veto, to have a say, but the final word of the House of Commons. And the final word on these amendments will be with the House of Commons. But, say, in this one, we've just put the Prime Minister's words into writing. So if you make a promise...
A little bit more, haven't you? Because at the end you say if there's no deal... That Parliament will have to have its say, and you didn't get that promise from the Brexit ministers.
Some actually of the MPs say that is what the Prime Minister said to them, but that's another matter. But what also has been said is there's very clear legal advice that you have to have parliamentary approval to start the process and to conclude the process. If the government doesn't accept some kind of amendments to conclude the process and the deal from Parliament, then it'll have to have new legislation. Much easier, much straightforward to do it now than go for all this legislation in 2 years' time.
Thanks very much for your time, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. Lord Lamont, I spy here. Good to see you, Lord Lamont. So what do you make of that? That's just the Lords doing its job, they say, holding to account the decisions of the government.
Well, I'm disappointed they carried the amendment. Firstly, I think the amendment is completely unnecessary because the Prime Minister said that there will be a vote in both houses on whatever the outcome of the negotiations is. But secondly, I think the amendment is defective because it effectively puts the Lords in the position of having a veto on any deal, which is completely unacceptable in this day and age.
Now, did you hear the words of your fellow former Chancellor, Lord Lawson, who is now expecting or says a bad agreement from the EU is likely? Do you agree with that? That's not what he was saying a year ago. A year ago, he was saying everything was going to be fine. It was almost certain we were going to get a free trade area.
No, Nigel has been of the opinion for quite some time that an agreement will be very difficult to get, and he thinks it would be better to settle for a WTO deal. I don't entirely agree with that. I would prefer a deal negotiated with the EU, but I'm quite happy to fall back on WTO arrangements.
But you think this will all be sorted out in the Commons next week?
I think it should be, yes, and then I hope that'll be the end of the matter.
Lord Lamont, thank you very much for joining us and all the guests here as the government is defeated for a second time in the House of Lords on this Article 50 bill. The fun moves over to the House of Commons early next week. Ian.
All right, thanks, Faisal. You're watching Ian King Live. Now, there was more evidence today of the impact that rising prices are beginning to have, thanks to the weakness of sterling since last June's referendum vote.
Yes, so that's the government has been defeated again for the second time. This on the vote asking for a meaningful vote at the end of the deal. It was a majority of 98, 366 contents, as they call them in the House of Lords, 268 not content. So that is another big defeat of nearly 100 votes, slightly smaller than, by 4, the EU nationals' defeat. So that means that when it goes from the House of Lords later this evening back across this lobby to the House of Commons, there will be 2 amendments to what the government had hoped would be a very simple bill for the Commons to have to consider. So the government has now been defeated for a second time on this Article 50 bill, and the interesting thing is in that final clause it specifies that if there should be at the end of this process no deal, then there could have to be a parliamentary vote. Now, the government is confident that the Commons will overturn this from the House of Lords, and the House of Lords then won't